Good afternoon, everybody. I think it's 3 or 4 minutes after the hour now, probably time for us to begin. Welcome. This is a webinar on how CTSA hubs can engage HL7 for purposes related to translational research. It's brought to you by the Next Generation Data Corps, part of the Center for Data to Health. And I'm Chris Shute, speaking at Johns Hopkins. Thank you. The outline for today is going to be basically who cares about fire and why. What are the HL7 working group and committee organization, some current working groups and proposals for related research activities, the fire development process as it's undergoing now at HL7, the fire acceleration program, and how CTSA hubs might most efficiently fit into these processes. What this is not about is why fire is necessarily relevant to CTSA activities. That's a separate concept in a webinar. This assumes that for whatever reason you are interested in contributing to fire and understanding what is involved. For those, nevertheless, for those who are not fully apprised, FHIR is, of course, the Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources, and it's coming to an EHR near you. This is the Faster 21st Century Cures proposed rulemaking from the Office of the National Coordinator. And as you can see in the draft regulation, all EHRs are going to require a standardized HPI and API, and that API will be FHIR, which is quite sweeping. It has vast implications for how we and any CTSA hub can access information in a consistent and comparable way with a standard interface, and that's really the point. That Federal Register page is in the URL on this particular page. Well, ONC is not the only person in the act. Most of the major health information vendors, Microsoft, Google, Apple, and Amazon are strongly behind FHIR. Most of them have developed FHIR services and servers and are exploring entering the market of provisioning clinical data and health information in the FHIR format from servers on their clouds. This is, I think, a vote of confidence by industry. And it's important to recognize that everybody is basically engaged with FHIR integration and development. This includes academia, it includes government, obviously, it includes big IT vendors, as you can see. EHR vendors, although not thrilled about it, are engaged in the process through many of the accelerator projects that we'll talk about. And of course, payers and academia are very much involved. Not to leave out NIH, there was an unprecedented announcement by Francis Collins last summer asserting that for research application using NIH funds and grants, investigators are strongly encouraged to explore the FHIR resources and the FHIR methodology around the management of clinical data. I say this is unprecedented because, to my knowledge, and I've asked many people, the NIH has never endorsed any standard ever. And for the NIH to basically publish a formal notice from the Office of the Director about the use of an interoperability standard like FHIR in clinical research is extraordinary. So we have independent and parallel engagement and interest in this process. In terms of translational research, CD2H wrote a blog shortly after NIH's announcement, in fact, in response to NIH's announcement, and it is at the cd2h.org FHIR page. I'm not going to go over the detail of that blog, but the graphic sort of shows a point-to-point effort to harmonize and synchronize data that is arguably not scalable on the left, and the somewhat aspirational notion that FHIR can become a highway for data delivery, dissemination, and interoperability applied to many research projects and data marts such as Odyssey, OMOP, or ACT, or PecorNet. You might ask, why does FHIR help? And I think the notion here is that it is really a microschema where the information, you can take a FHIR resource off the shelf. In this case, it's an observation resource. There are a very limited number of resources to have a parsimonious data model, and then populate it with a single observation. In this case, the provenance, the test payload, if you will, the PSA level or the serum sodium level, and the associated reference range can all be accommodated in this observation as a self-described object, making effectively a self-documented, self-describing data object that can be used for multiple purposes, including research, which is why many people call them pluripotent data objects as a mechanism for managing clinical information. This is a summary of what FHIR is and isn't, and I'm going to defer to my colleague Harold Solberg to comment on this.
Yeah, one of the things as FHIR grows in use and what have you, the name FHIR ends up referencing a whole lot more things than what one would expect. I mean, first and foremost, it's a really good acronym, and in fact, for a long time they had a pun contest. I don't remember what the reward was, but if you came up with a pun using FHIR that hadn't occurred before, there was a reward for it. They've determined, I believe, that there are no more to be had. That said, it's something that's easy to remember. But the next thing that FHIR is just pure and simply a new sort of technology stack. We have to remember that the OMG and UML aren't all that old, at least in the world that Dr. Stute and I live in. But it's a technology stack that's based from the bottom up on being open source. Everything is publicly available. Anybody can contribute. There's a huge community built around it. They had to give up on using Skype as a communication vehicle because their chats often exceeded 120 people, which was a cap. It's a very collaborative and welcoming community that pulls people in from all sorts of places. And what's interesting is while the object management group has touted model-driven architecture for years, and for the right price, one can get tools that sort of kind of do model-driven architecture. To the best of my knowledge, this is the first time that we've got model-driven architecture in mass. If you look at the FHIR pages out there, they are all generated from specifications. While the individual verbiage is manual, the entire FHIR website is developed out of models. They hold regular connectathons, the term hackathon here, but it's connectathons, where people prove new ideas and find clients and consumers and work through the issues on what needs to go through the technology. Has demonstrations, and in fact, one of the rules for FHIR is it can't exist in the specification if there isn't a believable, viable example of why it's there and how it's used. The maturity model for FHIR has overcome one of the big challenges of standardization, or is working to do as much. The issue that people face is when you don't want to take something up or start really implementing it if it isn't a standard, because it's going to change. On the other hand, if you wait until it's a standard but nobody really works with it, you're going to end up wanting to make changes, and it's already a standard. How do you change it? They've come up with a 5-level maturity model that allows parts of FHIR, portions of the FHIR specification, to move towards relative standardization, and it allows everybody to assess the risks of adoption. You can adopt early, have a lot of input, or you can wait until it's mature and hope that they've done a good job for what you need. So it's a platform for developing standards. It's called FHIR Core, and it's a way of putting new standards together and proposing it. It's also a set of standards. Now, what's interesting is that using it as a platform, anybody that wants can propose new models and look at new things. Using it as a set of healthcare data exchange standards, this is where there's some fairly tight control. The community as a whole has to buy into the idea of new resources and what goes into the resources, and it has to make sense to the group at large. And again, to just stress community, techies, researchers, and standard developers all form this. Next slide. This is an excerpt from the homepage, build.fire.org, or there's an hl7.fire or hl7.org/fire site that is a great entry point for it. The key really is that FIRE is focused on implementation. It is easy to implement. If you've worked with HL7 v3, you will appreciate that immensely. All sorts of tools and software, specification free for use. This turned out to be a real issue with the HL7 community, and it resulted in some significant changes in the way things are done. Everybody can use it. You don't have to pay. Interoperability, web standards, I'll let folks read the rest here. Next slide. Once we start talking about what it is, we also want to talk some about what it isn't. This is drawn from a blog by the father of FIRE, Graham Grieve. And one of the things he's talking about here is he said that FIRE is going to solve interoperability. He states bluntly, it's not. FIRE, as I mentioned in the previous slide, is a technology and a culture, and it allows people to collaborate, but FIRE unto itself is not an interoperability solution. Next slide. The key, however, is that FIRE has provided answers to people that need to use them. It's an important distinction between prescriptive standard models, thou shalt do it this way by gum, and models that say, if you really care about interoperating with people, if you want commonality, this is a way to do it. So FIRE allows, it provides a baseline upon which interoperability can be built, and it can be built locally, it can be built nationally as with the FIRE core, or it can be built globally, just depending upon the use cases.
So thank you, Harold. Let me just make some general comments about Health Level 7 or HL7 if you're not already familiar with it. It's really a massive community. It says here 4,000 volunteers, but that's a dynamic process. People come and go in greater than 50 countries. It's produced a lot of products over its history. Many of you are probably familiar with version 2, which is used in probably 90% of the healthcare implementations around the world today. Version 3 was something of an embarrassment, if we were to be honest. It was so elegant that nobody could use it. A derivative of that, the clinical document architecture, is usable and is widely used today. And you might say that, if you will, a version 4, not that anybody would call it that, has come along that I think has learned from many of the lessons of the past, and that is FIRE. And so the vision, I think, is shared by everybody. Access the right health data when they need it. And of course, HL7, which is a nonprofit organization, an international standards organization, and an open standards organization, where all their intellectual products are freely available to the world, seeks to provide those standards to serve those use cases. It has an organization, so it's bureaucracy like any others, a board of directors. But what really matters, and it's not really emphasized in this diagram in proportion, is that bottom row, which is the working groups. All the work eventually gets done by the working groups, and the working groups comprise as many as 2 or as many as 200 volunteers in a specific category. These are the current working groups, and you can see that one of them is biomedical research and regulation under the clinical steering division. That's an important group. and it is one that CD2H is increasingly aligning itself with. We'll talk about the history of HL7 engagement a bit later. But there is a broad spectrum of activity. Personally, I was involved, in fact, many years ago, I used to chair the vocabulary working group. But I think today, for purposes of CTSA, you can see that clinical genomics, biomedical research, clinical decision support, clinical quality are all topics and issues, learning health system closely allied with what the clinical and translational sciences community is interested in. It's important to recognize that the Biomedical Research and Regulation Work Group, which is the one we're primarily focusing on in CD2H at the moment, is deeply involved in fire resource development. Not any fire resource development, but those fire resources that are pertinent to the translational research use case. It's heavily staffed and sponsored by pharma, who in this context are our friend, because they're investing lots of intellectual resource, time, and effort to make sure that things like a research site, a research study, a substance specification, and I might add a research subject are also defined in a pragmatic way for translational research through fire resources. They've also created a lot of investigation-related implementation guides, including, of course, the bridge model, which is very central to FDA regulatory research and thus to a lot of clinical trials. Parallel to this are a number of groups that we can talk about. There's a new accelerator group, and we'll talk about accelerator groups in HL7 called Vulcan as a temporary name, that is focused on organizing the larger research community, including pharma, including industry, including translational researchers and academic researchers, into an organization that can partner with HL7 to bring forward the use case needs and requirements and to provide the resources needed to develop as a community the kind of fire resources that are needed. I can't emphasize strongly enough, as Harold, I think, made the point quite well, fire and HL7 for that matter, at the end of the day, are communities. And it's these communities that are needing organization and participation. There are related initiatives, the Smart on Fire initiative, bulk data, the clinical decision support, hooks that they're called, and of course, the translational research working group. The future and content of FIRE are really influenced and determined by two major groups, implementers and users. And I think in CD2H, and for that matter in CTSAs, the translational research community belongs in both the implementer and user group. Listed on the right are various accelerator groups, some of which you may be familiar with. The Argonaut project was major EHR vendors collaborating with a smaller number of clinical institutions, including Mayo Clinic when I was there, on the development of fire resources that would be central to the clinical management of patients. The Da Vinci project, which comes out of the Caring Group, is also focused on pragmatic resources, in this case on payers. And you can see other efforts here in a similar fashion, comprising communities of users partnered with implementers that in turn inform the standards development process. So you can see that consumer information is through the Caring Group. The Argonaut project was clinical. Da Vinci is payer. Codex is the NCI common oncology data elements that are working to develop common shared fire resources. And I might add, all of these groups are very tightly coupled to the fire development process, who coordinates the overlap and possible redundancies that might emerge if all of these groups operated in silo. They do not. They operate in close partnership with HL7 and with the fire development community to ensure that when commonality is demonstrated and overlap is demonstrated, that pragmatic mergers into a, if you call it a meta resource that satisfies the requirements of multiple communities can emerge. That's not to say that everybody has to use all the content of every resource, but the resource has to be capable of accommodating the use cases that are emergent from these kinds of divergent communities. And as I said earlier, the Vulcan project is a new accelerator that is in formation. It has not been officially formed, that we contributed to in CD2H to ensure that the research community has a corresponding coordination of activity. Other pragmatic mechanisms. This is a snapshot, as you see, of the June 1918 Dev Days conference. There are hundreds of people that attend these. They're held several times a year around the world. And I think this, again, underscores the reality that the FHIR development process at the end of the day is community. And I might add an enthusiastic and deeply engaged community. The advantage of leveraging FHIR for translational research is that the size of the community that is contributing to this is enormous. This is just one dev day and 1 year in one part of the world. As I said, there are many of these held around the world, and there have probably over time been many, many thousands of people who have contributed and participated in Dev Days activities. They're usually 3 days long and accelerate the pragmatic development of integrated resources for clinical research. For FHIR resource development. The clinical research community independently would be hard pressed to consistently and coherently come up with this much person power and this much intellectual capability. There are many clinical researchers integrated into this process, which is a feature. But again, those clinical researchers and indeed our community can leverage the person power and enthusiasm and resources of such a large distributed community. This is another modality of participation that Harold mentioned, the FHIR Connectathon or Hackathon. This happens to be a photograph from a 2017 hackathon. Harold and I have personally attended many subsequently and a few before. And on the right, you see the topics for this particular hackathon. I know Harold and I have participated in the evidence-based medicine track, which was not listed in this 2017 rendering, but you see it covers a spectrum of interests, including clinical reasoning and clinical research, not to be forgotten or overlooked. There are many related projects in the FHIR community. You're all familiar and you've probably heard of the Smart on FHIR project, which initially, when it was started as a SHARP project years ago, tried to make their own standards. And then they discovered that FHIR was well suited to the use cases that they anticipated, which was the development of applications and apps that would access information in a structured and practical way across electronic health records generally. The Smart on FHIR has created an open platform architecture, as you can see, with APIs. The data model, of course, is, at the end of the day, FHIR. An authentication layer, which may be swappable, but for the moment, it's now OAuth 2, and a standard user interface. Josh Mandel, of course, was instrumental in the Boston Children's effort to generate the Smart on FHIR process. And Josh, as you may know, has moved on to become Chief Health Information Architect for Microsoft and is promoting and developing FHIR in that vendor's environment and world. Another initiative that came out of the Boston Children's was bulk data on FHIR. FHIR, as it was originally designed, was a patient-by-patient process. It was designed to really move data around in the traditional HL7 model. It very quickly became clear, particularly for translational research use cases, that one might want to access a whole cohort of patients, a cohort of patients on a particular protocol, a cohort of patients corresponding to a particular phenotype, whatever the use case might be. So if you're looking at population health and cohort extractions from electronic health records or cohort updates and synchronization, then bulk fire is actually quite pertinent. It has a standard API which kicks off a data export process. It pulls to figure out how it's going. It generates new JSON files as it's going and operating, and then gets files and understands the bulk process. It's fair to say that the bulk fire specification is still in draft. This is highly pertinent to many, many use cases in translational research. And if people want an opportunity to really influence the future, then becoming involved with the bulk fire specification, I think, is one place where that can be done, because it is not yet ready for prime time. They're still looking at questions and issues around how do you deal with a partial response, an incomplete response? You know, how do you manage errors? How do you manage incomplete data? There are a lot of details and issues that are legitimate, that need to be reconciled in a way that the larger community has a consensus and can benefit from the underlying processes. Related activities in FHIR, of course, are clinical decision support, and this is as a moniker of hooks, so that you can describe decision support services, provide a service that uses them, evaluates the logic based on FHIR data, and then executes and returns cards or subsets of information that contain information for the underlying apps. This is relevant to lots of tools, including, I might add, clinical recruitment. Because if you think of clinical recruitment for trials and translational research as a kind of clinical decision support rule, have you seen patients that are relevant to my protocol? Then this is highly relevant. Here's an example where you have a medication order with various information cards of how much they might cost and what the alternatives are. Um, uh, Working in services informed by underlying EHR FHIR servers. A shamelessly clinical and financial example, but I think you get the point as it pertains to underlying translational research applications such as recruitment. FHIR is, as Graham said, not a complete solution to interoperability by design. It is deliberately underspecified so that it can actually be implemented in the UK or Germany or Japan or Australia or the United States, where we have different underlying um, regulations and expectations around coding systems, procedure coding systems, medication coding systems, formularies, and different types of restrictions that make it impractical for one standard to bind them all. As a way around that, or actually as a way to Foursquare address that, what complements any FHIR implementation is an implementation guide. And it's important to recognize that, like in the United States, the US Core Implementation Guide, which is supervised and authorized by the Office of the National Coordinator, so it's done in very tight collaboration with regulatory authority, says, okay, if you're going to use FHIR in the United States, then these are the bindings for things like medications and laboratory codes that make sense in the US, and here's how you should implement FHIR in that context. This precludes point-to-point interoperability across countries, but it enables countries to get as far as actually implementing something and leaving as a mapping exercise of content and value sets rather than worrying about mixed syntax or information models, the challenges of cross-country implementation. In CTSAs, one can readily see how, based on a US core, we might have implementation guides that allow applications for particular use cases as FHIR is adopted. And again, as an activity for CTSA hub interests in engaging in building those implementation guides and specifying them for consortiums and use cases that are relevant, such as perhaps the ACT consortium, is entirely consistent with a FHIR architecture. And this is just the fact to point out that the US Core Implementation Guide is very well published. as are most things in fire, publicly available, quite detailed. It's a formidable specification, but that's actually its feature because it has the depth and substance to really define something that approximates interoperability, at least within the user community of a specific implementation guide. This goes back to what Harold had outlined as a maturity model. And let me reiterate that the big problem with standards is that if you declare them standards too soon, then you probably didn't get it right because not enough people tried them out. And if you don't declare something a standard, then nobody has a chance to try it out and understand whether it helps or hurts and whether they like it. And the solution, of course, is really a 7-point maturity model, because as you see, there are 5 levels of maturity, 1 through 5, but there's also a 0 level as a draft, and then the 6th level, if you will, is the normative specification as a standard. And I don't think there are very few fire resources that are a normative standard at this point. The vast majority of them are in levels 1, 2, or 3, which is a feature because that means that fire is now sufficiently still pliable to address the needs of communities that are only now just discovering it so that they can try it, discover deficiencies or inadequacies that may exist, and participate in the process to make sure that they do address the needs of the communities that come to the table, thus having a graceful maturation to a normative artifact at the end of a maturity model process. This can take many years. It requires, at a minimum, multiple ballot rounds, but nevertheless, I think is a pragmatic compromise between specifying something too soon and making it normative too early. Here's an interesting example. You see the organizations along the bottom. This is Ken Gersing's effort working with NCATS, NLM, NCI, CD2H, FDA, CDC, and other organizations to create a fire design so that the Sentinel network, that CDC biosurveillance, or for that matter, a next generation CTSA a distributed query model, can have a standard software stack based on fire structures, the blue space being what is behind firewalls and academic organizations, or for that matter, any care provider in the country, and the green stack being what federal agents or other designated agents would use, so that we don't have a proliferation of one-of-a-kind of networks that would make that we all have to address and respond to. But there would be a canonical specification of what that network architecture would look like. And then it reduces to authorization agreements and data use agreements between and among providers of the data and users of the data, nevertheless operating over a common stack. This is the Common Data Model Harmonization Project. It's now in its 2nd year of funding and is something for you to look at very closely. As I said, CD2H is involved, and if people have a particular interest in this, we can certainly help you participate in that process. Here's an example of how that might work, where from electronic health record data, there's a canonical fire repository feeding in the translational research use case many data models that have important applications and important software communities around them and user communities around them. None of these communities are going to go away. ACT, Sentinel, PCORI, OMOP, they're all very important, but we think that they can be expedited from the clinical provider perspective through this kind of common software stack. At the same time, organizations like the CDC, FDA, and NIH NCATS can leverage the similar kinds of mechanism to achieve a federated query at scale across a national network with hopefully increasing numbers of participants and data providers. The Fire Foundation is another community to support the adaptation and implementation of HL7 Fire worldwide. This is more or less a private organization. It was started by the developer of Fire, Graham Grieve, and it, I think, illustrates the breadth and scope of the kind of enthusiasm that a group of independent communities and organizations and people would actually contribute to a fire foundation, not just simply time, sweat, and equity resource, but actually money to enable many activities to proceed. CD2H as an organization is advancing FIRE for the obvious use cases of making data discoverable, cohort generation, moving data, EHR extraction, interoperability, and quality assurance. Some of the recent activities that CD2H has engaged in is we actually pursued formally last summer an application to create a translational research working group at HL7. I think we've been strongly encouraged to explore partnering with a biomedical and regulatory research working group, which we are doing. So we participate in all their meetings, and so far I think have contributed importantly to their agenda, particularly as it relates to fire resource development. CD2H is now a principal in the new Fire Accelerator Group in partnership with pharma. That is analogous to the Argonaut project that Vulcan will do for research resources, what Argonaut initially did to standardize clinical research fire resources. CD2H now has roles on the HL7 Terminology Authority, that's Devera Gabriel, the HL7 Standards Board, that's myself, and of course this webinar is a way of further engagement. As far as CTSA hubs and members, there are multiple ways to engage. They're enumerated here. I'm not going to read them all, but we have a way to onboard. We have task teams. We have model harmonization groups. We have the health open terminology ecosystem, and of course, HL7 translational working groups, such as the biomedical regulatory research and regulatory group at HL7 is a place to start. Fire resources in terms of where to look and where to go for either education, connectathons, the Confluence page, the chat community, which is huge, or joining HL7 itself. I think these links are all pertinent. And we tried to put this under 40 minutes. It looks like we're going to be pretty darn close. I'd like to acknowledge many of the slides and the content from Wayne Kubrick and Ed Hammond. Graham Grieve contributed significantly, and I should acknowledge he is also a funded CD2H consultant, and Devera Gabriel, Harold, and I guess I contributed something too. So let's consider this open for questions. I'm not sure how to see them given my, oh, I can see them here, all right. Let's see, are we going to take questions verbally or are we going to take them by chat?
Yes, Chris, both ways. So we did put in chat that if anybody wants to put a question in, they can use chat or they can raise their hand and we'll, you can call on them and we'll unmute them.
All right.
Oh, okay. I see something in chat, Chris.
So what is the current status of the Translational Research Working Group? Good question, Gojin. As I said, we formally submitted a request for that. And we were advised to work with the Biomedical Regulatory and Research Group, which we're doing. I think it's important to understand that while they have to be very parsimonious about holding up new working groups, and basically told us that they felt that it was premature to create a new translational research group until we could demonstrate that the biomedical regulatory research group was not really meeting our needs, and that's what I think we are learning. As a practical matter, I think both Devera and myself are quite pleased with the focus and direction of biomedical research and regulation. Devera, do you want to comment on that?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, a matter of fact, I just got off a call this morning. We have weekly conference calls in BRNR. One of the things I will note, they're very organized, and there's actually a lot of activity that's going on within the BRNR work group. But one of the things I note is that often the representatives do tend to be really focused on randomized clinical trials, for example. And one of the things we chatted about a little bit today is the introducing other models of conducting research, for example, pragmatic clinical trials. And so that's an example, I think, where the CTSA involved folks could really help round out and really improve some of the very good work products that are coming out of that group, but to make them more kind of broader to address some of the broader use cases that we have within CTSAs. So anyway, like I said, we get together once a week in BRNR, and that would be a really great place to get started, to take a look at, you know, the kinds of projects that they're working on and see if it has relevance to, you know, work that you have going in your shop.
Thank you. Let's see, I don't see any hands raised at this time. Didn't mean to advance the slide. I don't know how to send it back. Last time I lost the presentation. Any further questions? If not, I think we've shared with you, and for those of you that are viewing this from the recording, we've shared with you many ways that you can be contacted, or you can contact us, that you can become engaged, and we welcome questions going forward on further that you might have around engaging HL7, engaging FHIR, or engaging its specific application to the research community.
Hey, Chris, we do have a question that got typed in from Heidi Doust. And Heidi says, can you comment on the CDM to FHIR plugin?
Well, the clinical data models, there are many mappings and resources. In fact, Emily Pfaff, who is our community liaison from the University of North Carolina, is coordinating our clinical data model harmonization and interoperability work group within CD2H and the data harmonization efforts. And Gojin, of course, has contributed to the development of Odyssey OMOP models to FHIR, to and from FHIR. There are a lot of PCORNet models to and from FHIR. And the data model harmonization effort I showed you earlier from Ken Gersing and HHS has deposited several mappings into CADSR. It's not yet a turnkey operation, but I think the aspiration is to say, if you have FHIR data, then we should be able to facilitate transition software that would take raw FHIR data and convert it into any common data model that is widely used, that we should maintain libraries of software to do that. There are also use cases for going the other way. For example, in the University of North Carolina, they have very, very sophisticated PCORNet resources, and Emily has built what she calls Campfire to go from a common data model back into FHIR to provide that level of baseline interoperability. Obviously, there's a lossy transform in one direction or another, never mind going from one to a second and on to a third, but the suite of tooling is what is being curated by CD2H to address this, and acknowledging a very large community contributing to its development, maintenance, and enhancement. I hope that answers the question. I'm sorry, I didn't see that question. It didn't come up on my
yeah, that does answer the question. I was really trying to figure out if the status of the plugins were turnkey, or if there was additional work that needed to be done to go from OMOP into, or go from FHIR to OMOP. And I think you answered.
Yeah. I don't know if Gojin, you want to add to that. You've been very active in that process. I'm not hearing you, Gojin, but that's all right.
Yes, I think we are working with broad committee, including CD2H project group, that we are looking to deeper for the mappings created by different groups, trying to harmonize those mappings. Hopefully we can have a high quality output for those mappings from different common data models to file published data.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Devere again. I would also just throw out there, if you're going to be at the AMIA meeting a week from today, we're going to be having a face-to-face meeting on exactly that topic. And so if you happen to also be attending AMIA, we would love to have you join us.
And that's, I believe, 6 o'clock in the Monroe room on the first floor, if I'm not
That's
mistaken.
right. That's right.
Yes. So we hope if you're interested in data model conversions, then this would be a forum for you to join. I think Emily Pfaff, in fact, from North Carolina, is going to lead it. Excellent. Any final questions? I'm not seeing any hands. I'm not seeing any questions. So let us thank you. And we appreciate your joining us. And as I said, if you have questions ongoing, we would be only too happy to address them. Thank you.